$4 billion bought Star Wars a new trilogy, and nobody ever wrote it down. 3 different directors took turns steering the saga's ending with no shared plan, each one reacting to the choices of the last instead of building toward one. Fans who waited decades for this final chapter, and new heroes built up to carry it, were left watching a story that never figured out where it was going. No unified roadmap. Disney paid $4 billion and $5 million for Star Wars and then let 3 different directors make up the ending as they went. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. There was no finished outline for the sequel trilogy when The Force Awakens started shooting. Compare that to what came before. The original trilogy had one guy steering the ship. The prequels had that same guy, for better or worse, still steering. Say what you want about George Lucas's dialogue, but he knew where Anakin ended up before he ever wrote INT. Tatooine, the sequel trilogy, had no equivalent. Zero. J.J. Abrams directed and co-wrote The Force Awakens in 2015. Rian Johnson wrote and directed The Last Jedi in 2017. Abrams came back for The Rise of Skywalker in 2019. 3 different creative visions, 3 different sets of answers, and almost no communication between them about where the whole thing was supposed to land. Lucas actually had story treatments for what came after Return of the Jedi. Those got shelved after Disney's 2012 purchase, and the new leadership decided to build something else from scratch, in real time, film by film. Nobody sat down and wrote the ending first. The damage shows up fast if you watch the trilogy back to back. The Force Awakens plants mysteries about Rey's parents and builds up Snoke as some grand looming threat. The Last Jedi walks straight up to both of those setups and torches them on purpose. Then The Rise of Skywalker has to walk backward through the wreckage, contradicting Johnson's answers to salvage something that resembles a payoff. That is not one story told in 3 chapters. That is 3 separate pitches for what a Star Wars sequel could be, stitched together after the fact and presented as a single saga. And somewhere in that mess were actual fans, people who waited over 30 years to see Luke, Han, and Leia share a screen again, watching a franchise burn its own goodwill trying to answer questions it never agreed on in the first place. But when you have no map and no plan, you reach for the one thing you know already worked. So the very first film didn't try to go somewhere new. It went somewhere very, very familiar, rehashing the original trilogy. A desert kid finds a droid with a secret, joins a ragtag rebellion, and blows up a planet-killing superweapon in the final act. That's not a summary of A New Hope. That's also the plot of The Force Awakens, made almost 40 years later with a bigger budget and a new coat of paint. Rey is a scavenger on a sand planet, same as Luke. BB-8 is carrying something the bad guys desperately want, same as R2-D2. Starkiller Base blows up planets, plural, which technically makes it worse than the Death Star, and yet the movie never bothers explaining how the First Order built a weapon that size, or why the New Republic just let it happen. One day it doesn't exist, then it's eating solar systems. Nobody in charge. Remember, this wasn't an accident. The Force Awakens was built to be comfortable. Stormtroopers, X-Wings, the Falcon getting chased through wreckage, all of it engineered to make longtime fans feel exactly what they felt in 1977. And it worked, financially, spectacularly. But comfort and originality don't usually show up to the same party. Zoom out and the patterns gets worse. The Force Awakens echoes A New Hope. The Last Jedi tries to be the moody, complicated Empire Strikes Back. The Rise of Skywalker throws a giant fleet battle and a dark side emperor at you, just like Return of the Jedi did. 3 movies, 1 skeleton, borrowed twice. The First Order looks like the Empire because it basically is the Empire, just renamed. The Resistance looks like the Rebellion because it basically is the Rebellion, just renamed. 30 years pass in-universe and somehow nothing actually changed. No new government, no new war, no new stakes, just familiar factions wearing name tags. A trilogy with no plan doesn't invent, it imitates. And when you open a 9-film saga by remaking your own beginning, you've spent your fresh ideas before the story even starts. If you're going to remake the past, you also have to bring the past on screen, and the people fans had waited over 30 years to see again were handed the raw end of that deal. The legacy heroes Han, Luke, and Leia never share a single scene together across 3 movies. 0, not once. 30 years of waiting, and the trilogy that promised to reunite the trio that defined an entire generation of blockbuster filmmaking simply never wrote the scene. That's not a budget problem or a scheduling accident. That's a structural choice, and it tells you exactly how these films saw their own icons. Watch what actually happens to each of them. Han shows up in The Force Awakens having slid backward into the smuggler life he supposedly left behind decades earlier, running the Falcon. From debt collectors like Return of the Jedi never happened. Then Kylo Ren puts a lightsaber through his chest, and Han's entire purpose in the story ends up being the thing that finally breaks his own son. Luke fares even worse. He's introduced in The Last Jedi as a hermit who exiled himself after considering murdering his sleeping nephew, a man so hollowed out he throws away his father's lightsaber the second Rey hands it to him. He gets one last stand, an astral projection stretched across the galaxy, and then he dies from the effort. And Leia, robbed of a real ending by Carrie Fisher's death, gets stitched together in The Rise of Skywalker out of leftover footage shot years earlier for a completely different film. 3 heroes, 3 exits, all of them engineered to hand momentum to somebody else's story rather than close out their own. Nothing in the films ever explains what Endor actually costs these people. Han and Leia's marriage collapsed. Luke's entire Jedi Academy burned down, literally. You only get that context if you go read the novels and comics sitting outside the theatrical trilogy, because the main saga treats that history as backstory nobody needed to dramatize, add it up, and a pattern starts to look less like coincidence and more like intent. Han dies to launch Kylo's arc. Luke dies to launch Rey's. Leia barely survives long enough to appear in the next one. Every one of them gets spent, not written. The fans who showed up for a reunion got a funeral procession instead. 3 separate goodbyes standing in for the one scene they actually wanted. So if the old heroes were being spent as fuel, the whole point had to be the ones they were fueling, which makes it stranger that the trilogy could barely keep its new leads in the same room. The new trio. A stormtrooper breaks his programming, drops his weapon, and helps a captive escape mid-battle. That is one of the boldest openings in the entire saga, and the trilogy barely does anything with it for the next 2 films. Finn's defection in The Force Awakens is genuinely great stuff. Blood on his helmet from a friend who just died next to him, refusing to fire on villagers, walking away from the only life he has ever known. That is trauma and indoctrination handled with real weight. Then the sequels take that character and turn him into the guy who yells one name across every planet he visits. Poe Dameron's situation is even more telling, because it is not a writing choice. It is an accident. He was supposed to die in the opening act of The Force Awakens. Abrams liked him too much to kill him off, so he lived, and the trilogy spent the next 2 films figuring out what to do with a main character who was never supposed to exist past minute 20. Nobody planned for Poe to still be standing in Return of the Jedi's successor, let alone leading it. The Rise of Skywalker eventually bolts on a spice smuggler backstory to give him something resembling depth. It plays exactly like what it is. A patch applied 5 years late, stitched onto a character the trilogy never built a real foundation for in the first place. And the 3 of them, the trio the marketing sold you on, barely share a scene together until the final film. The Last Jedi actively splits them apart. Rey gets an island and a redemption plot with Kylo. Finn gets a casino planet detour that most fans forget by the credits. Poe gets a mutiny subplot on a fading resistance cruiser. 3 separate movies happening inside one movie, none of them building the chemistry the whole premise depended on. This is the same missing plan that gutted Han, Luke, and Leia, just aimed at the people who were supposed to replace them. 3 films, 3 chances, and Finn's moral journey, Poe's leadership arc, and Rey's search for belonging all get started and then abandoned the moment the next crisis shows up. A generation of viewers watch these 3 get introduced like the next Han, Luke, and Leia, complete with the same instant chemistry and mythic framing, and watch that promise quietly evaporate one detour at a time, film by film, until barely any of it was left standing by the finale. And when a whole ensemble is left underbuilt, all the weight falls onto one person. The trilogy bet everything on her, then couldn't decide 3 separate times who she even was. Rey's messy character arc. One character got asked the same question 3 times by 3 different people, and got 3 different answers. Who is Rey? It sounds simple. It became the trilogy's clearest tell that nobody upstairs had agreed on the story before the cameras rolled. Start on Jakku. Rey shows up as a scavenger, alone, no family, no name anyone recognizes. She touches a lightsaber and gets slammed with visions. Obi-Wan's voice, flashes of a past she doesn't understand, and the film ends without answering a single one of those questions. That's fine on its own. Mysteries are supposed to sit there and breathe for a while. Then the second film opens that door and burns the house down. Rey's parents weren't hiding a legacy. They were nobodies, junk traders who sold their kid for drinking money and never looked back. No secret bloodline, no chosen family, just a girl who taught herself to be powerful with nothing behind her, which is a genuinely strong idea. The Force doesn't care who your dad was, except the very next film throws that idea out the airlock. Rey isn't a nobody anymore. She's Palpatine's granddaughter, heir to the guy responsible for basically every catastrophe in the saga, and the movie has about 2 hours to make that land emotionally. It doesn't really have time. The reveal shows up more like a plot requirement than a character discovery. 3 movies, 3 completely different answers to the exact same question. Mysterious chosen one, powerful nobody. Secret, dark side royalty. That's not a character arc, that's 3 different writers reaching into the same box and pulling out whatever theme felt right that week. And through all of it, Rey barely fails at anything. She flies the Falcon almost immediately, duels trained warriors almost immediately, pulls off Force feats senior Jedi never attempted, with barely any training shown and almost 0 lasting consequences when things go wrong. For a character the entire saga is supposedly resting on, she's oddly untouched by it. She was supposed to be the safe bet, the one piece of the trilogy every fan could hold on to while everything else got rewritten around her. Instead, she became proof that even the foundation was never poured the same way twice. But rewriting who she was didn't happen by accident. One film in the middle deliberately took the mysteries the first movie set up and tore them down on purpose, and that decision split the fandom in half. The Last Jedi. Snoke dies in the first act. No backstory, no monologue, no explanation for how a nobody built an empire out of the ashes of the last one. Just a lightsaber, betrayal, and a body cut in half on a throne room floor. The single biggest mystery The Force Awakens spent 2 hours building gets answered with a shrug. That is not an accident. That is a mission statement. The obvious version of this movie honors what came before it. The actual version spends 2.5 hours setting fire to it. Rey's parents, the question fans had been theorizing about for 2 years, get reduced to 2 words. Nobody. Nobody. Luke Skywalker, the same man who refused to give up on his father, even while getting electrocuted by an emperor, is revealed to have stood over his own nephew with a lit blade, seriously considering murdering him in his sleep. The man who preached hope in Return of the Jedi is now a guilt-ridden hermit who has cut himself off from the Force entirely and wants the Jedi Order to die with him. That is the trilogy arguing with itself on screen in real time, and it does not stop there. Finn and Rose burn an hour of runtime on Canto Bight, a Casino Planet subplot that changes nothing about the war outside it. The Resistance spends the middle act in a slow-motion space chase that resolves exactly where it started. Meanwhile, Holdo pulls off a lightspeed ramming maneuver that ends a battle in half a second and quietly rewrites what starships are capable of doing to each other for the rest of the saga. Here is the part that makes this so hard to simply hate. Critics loved it. Audiences were split straight down the middle. It made real money. The Luke and Kylo standoff on Crate is one of the most beautiful sequences in the franchise's history. None of that changes what the film actually did to the story sitting underneath it. Somewhere in all of this is a franchise built on the promise of 3 legends reuniting one last time, and a new trio the audience was told mattered, both quietly getting pulled out from under a plan that no longer existed. So the final film inherited a torn-up map and a dead villain, and it had to conjure a threat big enough to end 9 movies. Its solution was a single line that fans have been laughing at ever since. Somehow, Palpatine returned. 4 words. That is the entire explanation the final movie gives for bringing back the single most dead villain in the saga. Poe Dameron says it out loud in the actual movie, as if saying it plainly makes it less absurd. It does not. Palpatine got thrown into a reactor shaft by his own apprentice and exploded. That was the ending. That was the point. And the Rise of Skywalker opens by telling you, through a crawl and a mystery broadcast, that none of it actually finished the job. Go back to that torn map and that dead villain from the opening of this video. Snoke got executed halfway through the trilogy with zero explanation for who he was or where he came from. Nobody had an answer ready. So the final film reached backward, past 2 entire movies, and pulled out the one name guaranteed to feel like Star Wars no matter what. Turns out, Palpatine had been running the First Order the whole time, secretly building Snoke as a puppet, and hiding on a planet called Exegol with a fleet of planet-killing Star Destroyers nobody had ever mentioned. That is not a twist. That is a franchise admitting, on screen, that it never had a villain plan past Episode 8, and it is not just lazy, it is expensive. Anakin burned his own life, ending the Sith. Luke's entire arc was built on believing that ending mattered. Resurrecting the man they died to stop was not just cheap in one movie. Quietly rewrites what the original trilogy was actually about, turning the franchise's most iconic victory into a pause button. The saddest part is what got skipped to make room for him. Kylo Ren spent 3 films positioned as the actual threat, a broken kid who could go either way. Instead of finishing that story, Trilogy handed the final boss fight to a corpse. The fans who waited decades for one more Star Wars ending, and the new characters built up like they were the future of the franchise, both got the same answer. Reheated nostalgia, standing in for a plan nobody ever wrote. That is the whole trilogy in one line. Every dropped thread, every reverse choice, every borrowed beat from the original saga, all of it leads to a production with no map, choosing the one villain everyone already recognized. Somehow, Palpatine Returned was never a plot hole, it was a confession. With no roadmap, the only way to end the story was to pretend the last one had never really ended at all. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.